Continued fallout for AOC after her disastrous performance in Munich. We have an early unintended consequence of the Democrats' DHS shutdown as we see a massive wastewater spill in Washington, D.C. And then the campaign ad that ended Eric Swalwell's career. All of that and so much more today on 10 Minute Drill.
Everybody get up, get up.
The story of America is the story of an adventure.
I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you.
We are a nation under God, and I believe God intended for us to be free.
Continued fallout for AOC after her disastrous faceplant in Munich. We talked about this a little bit yesterday. One of the most notable parts of that faceplant was her inability to give an answer to a very basic question about China and Taiwan.
Would and should the U.S. actually commit U.S. troops to defend Taiwan if China were to move?
I think that this is such a, I think that this is of course
In addition to that very, very awkward clip about China and Taiwan that she should have been prepared for as a member of Congress, she also had embarrassing moments talking about the history of Mexico, about where Venezuela is on a map, and also flippant comments about Israel and genocide. But as she got home and has seen the fallout in the embarrassing coverage and the mockery, she did what any Democrat does. Called her friends at the New York Times to try and get a sympathetic rebuttal piece. This from Kellen Browning at the New York Times. AOC came to Munich to warn about the far right. Coverage focused on 2028 and verbal missteps. She gave me a call. Now that's quite a tell. Again, that a Democrat thinks her best way to sort of fix the story is to call the New York Times, Democrat's best friend. Everyone's got this story wrong, that this is about me running for president, she said. Global democracies are on fire the world over. The way her performance was microscopically dissected through the lens of what it meant for a hypothetical White House campaign frustrated AOC. She said she worried that her message was being lost in all the commotion. She said her meetings in Munich had been substantive, but what went viral was her flub on Taiwan and speculation about 2028. Am I acting like someone who's trying to run? No, because I'm here for a very different specific purpose. Now, Politico also reported that she had been planning for this trip for months. But by the looks of that preparation, she was probably just holding up flashcards of people and calling them despot, totalitarian, dictator, things like that. If you are a member of Congress and you can't answer a very basic question about China and Taiwan, you should not go to the most prominent foreign policy and security conference in the world. And if this feels like deja vu as you're hearing this complaint from AOC, is because it sounds a lot like Kamala Harris, who believed that any questions outside of the lane of what she had prepared to speak for was out of bounds. Kamala Harris, her staff always said she wanted to talk about issues like justice, social justice, LGBT issues, and yet she was pigeonholed into talking about things like the border. But as a person in a position of power, media believes she should be able to speak on a couple of different issues instead of just being pigeonholed into one. AOC went all the way to Europe and made a major fool of herself. The question is, will she learn from it and open a book? My guess is probably not. As you may or actually may not have heard, the Department of Homeland Security is shut down. We talked about this quite a bit last week. The Democrats were shutting down the Department of Homeland Security to protest against ICE, even though ICE is funded until 2029. And if you watch the Democrats closely as we've gotten up to this shutdown, it's been pretty clear that they don't view any consequences of a shutdown. Here's Hakeem Jeffries on Sunday.
But fundamentally, we need change that is dramatic, that is bold, that is meaningful, and that is transformational.
As you watch Hakeem Jeffries throughout this entire fight, it's very clear he just wants the government shut down. He wants DHS shut down because they fear their online base who's angry at ICE much more than the consequences of shutting down FEMA, TSA, the Coast Guard, our cybersecurity authority, and everything else that falls under DHS except for ICE. But there will be consequences to this. Here is a TSA employee talking about the challenges of not getting paid and not having funding.
We signed up to do a very important mission to keep the traveling public safe. And again, to constantly be put back and forth through this, well, we're going to get paid, not get paid, but yet we are expected to show up for our jobs.
And now with President Trump calling for FEMA to support the cleanup effort after the crazy, terrible, and embarrassing DC area wastewater spill, we're seeing that there's going to be a very real and immediate consequence to Democrats defunding FEMA. We talked about this a little bit yesterday, but DC is currently in the middle of one of the weirdest, stinkiest crises we have seen in a very long time. The fact that 250 million gallons of wastewater has blown through a pipe into the Potomac River, and it could end up being as much as 1 billion gallons of wastewater. That is the equivalent of 1,500 Olympic-sized pools of human waste flowing into the Potomac. And I would just give a little bit of context. The Potomac already was incredibly dirty. 8 or 9 years ago, there was a story of a girl who went canoeing in the Potomac, and she had a cut on her leg that touched the water, and she died because of the bacterial infection that came from that. That is the Potomac's baseline. Now consider it with 1 billion gallons of wastewater, and the fact that we already know that the communication around this has been terrible. We're going to get to that in just a second, but as this has unfolded, yesterday, President Trump announced that the federal government would be stepping in to help. I'm directing federal authorities to immediately provide all necessary management, direction, and coordination to protect the Potomac, the water supply in the capital region, and our treasured national resources in our nation's capital city. Now, Maryland Governor Wes Moore was also called out in that Truth Social post for failing to do anything about this, including even saying anything to his constituents about the fact that this massive biohazard is creeping down the Potomac towards them. But here's how Wes Moore responded. Apparently, the Trump administration hadn't gotten the memo that they're actually supposed to be in charge here. This is very important because this is not accurate. The Potomac Interceptor, the pipe area that had the burst, is actually controlled by DC Water and Sewage, which is not controlled by the federal government. It's controlled by the government of Washington, D.C., but in coordination with the governments of Maryland and Virginia. And so this is Wes Moore's problem. But it's not just the fact that Wes Moore played a role in letting this happen and has not done anything to really help clean it up. It's the fact that both Wes Moore and Virginia Governor Abby Spanberger haven't said anything about it to their constituents until President Trump called them out. Abby Spanberger, our newly elected governor of Virginia, still hasn't said anything about it. And we have some idea why. She's very, very busy pushing for 50 new taxes on everyone from small businesses to families. She's busy pushing for gun confiscation, getting rid of 4 Republican congressional districts in the state, turning Virginia back into a sanctuary city, getting rid of mandatory minimum laws that allow sex criminals and all sorts of violent criminals back on the streets. That's what Abby Spanberger's been doing instead of warning these counties in Northern Virginia that heavily voted for her, that pay some of the highest taxes in the country, that they are being threatened by a massive human wastewater biohazard. So it is shocking that the Democrat governors of these states haven't been more engaged. But I would ask you, is there a better image of the failures of Democrat governance in the year 2026 than a river of human waste flowing towards taxpayers who are being asked to pay more in taxes while the governors are pointing fingers at each other and President Trump saying, not it? With Maryland Governor Wes Moore in the spotlight, we wanted to talk a little bit about some of the reporting we've been hearing about him in the last few weeks and the fact that he has largely fumbled the communication around it. First, from the Washington Free Beacon, Democrat Wes Moore stumbles during CBS Town Hall when asked to address Free Beacon reporting about exaggerations and falsehoods in his life story. Now, the Washington Free Beacon has been on this for months now. One bucket that they first focused on was the fact that Wes Moore has claimed to be a foremost expert on radical Islam in the wake of 9/11, in part because he had written a thesis on it at Oxford. However, Oxford has no record of any thesis from Wes Moore and also no record of him being a doctoral student. So this is going to start sounding a little bit more like a combination of The Great Gatsby and Tim Walz and a number of other Democrats who have been caught inflating their resume. But another narrative that the Washington Free Beacon dove into was claims. Wes Moore says the KKK chased his great-grandfather out of South Carolina. Historical records tell a different story. Now, he's told this story a number of times in the last few years. It's become a very compelling part of his bio. What the Washington Free Beacon found is that it likely didn't play out that way at all. It's a story straight out of Hollywood, and it was a central feature of Moore's 2022 campaign stump speech, in which he described a version of American patriotism wherein loving your country does not mean lying about its history. However, detailed church archival records, as well as contemporary newspaper coverage, indicate that Thomas, a Jamaican native, made an orderly and public transfer from South Carolina to the island of his birth, where he was appointed to succeed a prominent Jamaican pastor who had died unexpectedly a week earlier. What the Free Beacon was able to find from a number of media reports is Wes Moore's grandfather was not really chased by anybody. He was a popular pastor who completed an orderly transfer to another opening for pastors in Jamaica. So what the Free Beacon's reporting points out is that Moore has never really effectively been able to corroborate his more Hollywood-friendly version of events here, and public records seem to suggest that it went very, very differently. And Moore hasn't been able to sort of make his case the same way. He hasn't really been able to refute questions about his bio on other things that the Free Beacon has pointed out, like Moore falsely claimed that he was born and grew up in Baltimore, which he did not. He was inducted into the Maryland Football Hall of Fame, an organization that doesn't exist. He received a Bronze Star for his service in Afghanistan, which he did not. And that he had a difficult childhood in the Bronx in Baltimore, despite attending New York's elite private Riverdale Country School, where JFK went to school. So again, it seems like Wes Moore has a long history of lying, in some cases even trying to point to America as a racist country if it will help him brandish his bio. And his inability to answer these questions and clear any of this up is continuing to dog him into situations like a CBS town hall.
But Oxford says it does not have a copy of your thesis. Did you submit it?
It's this politics of personal destruction, where as a person who has nothing, neither to be ashamed of or nothing to exaggerate about my life, that this is the thing that conservative right-wing blogs want to attack.
Calling something the politics of personal destruction to avoid answering a question, which, if you watch this full interview, huge kudos to Media Research Center for clipping and promoting this, and of course the Washington Free Beacon for their original investigation. But when you try and dismiss something as the politics of personal destruction to avoid answering very simple and substantive questions, you know you have a problem on your hands. And this is exactly what really handicapped Tim Walz as a vice presidential candidate. The fact that there were sort of holes everywhere in his bio that led to more and more holes and followed him. And this is going to be the same story with Wes Moore, unless he can figure out how to answer some of these glaring questions, or basically just acknowledge the fact that, like The Great Gatsby, his entire life story that he's shared with the world to get this far in politics is based on lies. Our favorite, Harry Enton, has another great update.
Voters who say the Democrats are now too liberal. Look at this percentage. It was 42% in 96, 48% in 2013, now 58%. Democrats who think of themselves as democratic socialists among all Democrats, including those independents who lean towards the Democratic Party. Look at this. We're talking about a third.
So the whole country is viewing Democrats as too liberal, at the same time as we're seeing all-time lows in approval rating for that party, yet within the Democrats, 1 in 3 of them consider themselves to be democratic socialists, which is a huge issue. But it also helps you understand why Democrats in Washington do some of the things they do. They're trying to cater and appeal to an increasingly radicalizing base. For example, here's Chuck Schumer. Chuck Schumer moves to make Stonewall Pride flag permanent. It's a living symbol of struggle and resilience. Chuck Schumer wants to give the Pride flag the same status as the American flag, which he knows is never going to happen and is never going to pass. But it's a desperate signal to the far left. Consider the fact that right now Chuck Schumer has the government shut down. DHS is shut down. FEMA cannot help with the biggest bio disaster we've seen in a very long time. And Chuck Schumer is introducing bills to help the Pride flag. For our You Can't Make It Up segment today, I actually want to highlight an ad from a Democrat. This touches on something that is very, very important to me.
I should be working right now. I should be working right now. I should be at the Capitol.
That is from Democrat Tom Steyer, and he's going after Eric Swalwell for a theme that we've talked about quite a bit here, which is being missing in action. We as taxpayers are paying his salary to come in and vote, and yet he has missed more votes than a guy who died almost a year ago. And that should matter to people, as this guy's asking for a promotion to become the governor of the great state of California, to potentially, hopefully, someone can get in there and clean up some of the mess that Gavin Newsom has left behind. So I hope people will take Tom Steyer's ad here to heart. That is all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us on 10 Minute Drill. Please leave a review, like, subscribe, tell your friends, and we will see you tomorrow.